welcome everybody, and thank you for letting me be on this wonderful, wonderful program with you because I have always wanted to be a teacher. And I've always been in administration and in music and in ministry, and I guess I get to teach in that way. But since I've started doing Dred Scott since 2006, actually, it has been a joy to be a part of the classroom. So thank you so much for having me. We have a lot that we can cover today, and it looks like we really are going to have more time than we expected. So I think we'll be able to cover even more. I always, I can't see you guys because obviously we're on the computer, but I like to ask people how many of you feel comfortable if somebody walked up to you and said, "Tell me about Dred Scott." And most of the time when I'm in an audience of adults and even attorneys, I was in a law firm once and not one single person raised their hand. And it was stunning, but usually I might get 3 or 4 or 5 people out of 50 who might say maybe. And so it lets me know that even though Dred Scott's name is known, and even though he's very important, and even though this is a major linchpin in our history, we really don't know his story, and we really don't always understand how important it is. So today I'm going to go through and I'm going to share with you the legal aspect. I'm going to blend in the personal aspect. And then I'm going to, as we go and toward the end, and as you ask questions, give you a lot of little tidbits that are really not known. And since you guys live out east, I'm pretty sure you probably don't know a lot of this. We've uncovered so much in the last 15 years, and just the mere fact that I researched it. And when the anniversary came in 2007, it was the 150th anniversary of the Dred Scott decision. So I felt, wow, I don't want to sit at home and just watch it on the news. I think we can do better than that. So I decided to start the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. At the time, I worked at the Brian Cave Law Firm. It's now called Brian Cave, Peyton Laisner, I think, and or Leighton Paisner, rather. And they were very supportive. Immediately, they were on board. So whatever I needed to do, I could do. And we had this wonderful program. The thing about the foundation is I said, well, we've got to stand for something. So what are we going to stand for? And I very, very strongly believe I just got this download from heaven that said it should be commemoration, education, and reconciliation. Well, commemoration was easy. We were talking about an anniversary. We were talking about people who needed to be remembered. And education was like my middle name. I love it. And I was always, I'm there. That's not a problem. But what does reconciliation mean? And I had no clue what I was supposed to do or what would happen, but I just went with it. And it has turned out to be probably the most highlighted aspect of what we've done so far. That won't all be on my PowerPoint, but I will share with you as we go through some of the wonderful things that have happened in terms of that. And it lets us know that out of a very difficult story, the Dred Scott story, which was a difficult story, has come some really wonderful things, and there's more to come. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the program. Hopefully you know a little bit about him, and hopefully you will learn a lot more. I consider him a civil rights pioneer. And I say that because even though, obviously slavery did not start with Dred Scott, slavery did not start only in 1619, but as times came about and as things were going along the way they were, Dred Scott, the decision, put a big wrench in it and really flipped it on its head. And the man behind the case, for whose name it is, this individual, we talk about him as having courage and being brave. And sometimes I think to myself, okay, I know the story kind of inside and out, and I know he was, but I wonder if that's being conveyed to people why he was or why that is true. So as we go, and again, write down any questions you have, because I love that part of the program. We'll talk more about some of the things that make this a more courageous act than just saying he sued for his freedom and he was a slave. You figure slaves aren't supposed to do anything. So how could he do this? And that's that question we're going to answer. So we don't know his birth date. He was born around 1799. Some people say 1805, so give or take, we'll just say 1800. And in his case, what made him a little different than his neighbor down the road, Nat Turner. Nat Turner had a rebellion in early 1830s. And Dred Scott decided that he would not take that route, that he would choose the courts. And because there had been a long-standing precedent in our area, and he did have legitimate claim, he did go and sue for his freedom. So this is his story. Peter Blow was a gentleman who owned a 800-acre plantation. I've actually been on the plantation myself. I've seen it. I have pictures of it. There is no house there, but it's a lot of land, and it still has cotton on it. Peter Blow had a wife and ultimately 11 children. And all of those children did not survive, as is the case with many families back in the 1800s. They lost a lot of their babies. But out of the 11, several did live, and 3 are very important to the Dred Scott story. As I said, their neighbor down the road there in Southampton, Virginia, was Nat Turner. And Nat Turner actually started his rebellion right after Peter Blow took his family and left Virginia. And as I think about it, and here's a way that you can teach yourself, because like I said, I love education. I love learning and researching it. And sometimes you just have to sit back and take something that you read and then think about it. You know, don't just go with the words on the paper, but think a little bit about it. And as I was looking at the dates, dates are easy to help you make this decision. 1830s is when Dred Scott and the family left Virginia. 1831 is when Nat Turner began his rebellion. Had Dred Scott stayed in Virginia, and I may have those dates just slightly off, but the point is he left prior to, and had he stayed there, then he might have been caught up in this rebellion. Not that he necessarily would have gone and been in it, but the mere fact that he was a slave in the area, and that would have possibly caused his death, because slaves who lived there who had nothing to do with Nat Turner's rebellion were killed. They may have known something, they might have been a part of it, whatever it was, they were just going to wipe them all out. So he was actually saved by his owner deciding to pick up and move west. And so that's what he did. Peter Blow moved west to Alabama, and they lived in Huntsville and Florence, Alabama for several years. He was trying to create another living and livelihood for his family. Over the years, that worked and it didn't. So eventually they moved to St. Louis. When they moved to St. Louis, Peter and his wife, Elizabeth, she became very ill and died, and he died the following year. Before he passed away, however, he wanted to cure his debts. So he sold Dred Scott to an army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson. And Dr. Emerson took Dred Scott into free territory, which at the time was a place called Fort Snelling, which was in Illinois near Chicago. It no longer exists, but in Fort Snelling, Wisconsin territories, where the story really is seated, also free territory. He took him there, and that is where he met and married his wife. Her name was Harriet Robinson. Harriet Robinson was owned by Major Tolliver. Major Tolliver was a justice of the peace. And sometimes I have to laugh, because when we're in the classroom and we're talking to young people, they don't know some of the older terms. So if I could see you, I would ask you, do you know what a justice of the peace is? You might want to raise your hand and let your professor know. You either do or you don't, but you may not. Well, to me, when we grew up, we knew a justice of the peace is somebody you could go to get married if you didn't want to get married in church. So obviously he had other duties, but this gentleman was an Indian, let's see what we could call him. He was someone who arbitrated between the Indians and the army, and he was a justice of the peace. So he had the right to marry them. He owned Harriet. He let her either move in and live with Dred Scott because he sold her to Dr. Emerson, or he gave her to Dr. Emerson, and we don't really know. Now we could get into Fort Snelling being free territory and how that impacts their status. Were they slaves? Were they free? They really were free, but they were kept as slaves. And so for them to be married and have a real wedding, which was officiated by Major Tolliver, was a big deal and very rare, actually. It also was symbolic of what would be true of free people. So I think what was going on in Fort Snelling was that they were being kept, and they really considered them still their slaves, but they kind of acted like they were free because they realized it was free territory. But they could not get away or walk away. So Dred and Harriet married in 1836. In 1836, now, they had the opportunity to stay there or leave, but they did stay. But at some point, they recognized that there was a law in Missouri that said, and in the territories actually, that said if you were once free, meaning you had ever lived in free territory, then you were always free. And in order to fight or despite that, you would have to prove these things, that you had been wrongfully held in servitude, and that the plaintiff, in this case, the plaintiff is a person who goes and sues someone else, and that person they sue is the defendant. So Dred and Harriet would have been the plaintiffs. They had to prove that they were free blacks. They also would have to prove that they had been physically abused while they were held as slaves, and then they needed witnesses to testify of that fact. Well, having been on free territory with Dr. Emerson, they came back to St. Louis. And when they came back to St. Louis in 1843, Dr. Emerson passed away. That means that the family now, and I say family because they had a daughter and they were about to have a second daughter, they were owned now by the widow, Irene Sanford Emerson. Dr. Emerson passes away. She, being a young lady whose parents were very, very pro-slavery. Her father even helped start the Slavery Society in St. Louis. She wasn't about to give them their freedom. Dred Scott offered her $300 as a down payment to pay for their freedom, as well as surety by one of this army personnel, and they were going to pay the rest. She said no. They tried everything they could before they tried their last recourse. Dred and Harriet also went to church in St. Louis, which is now called Central Baptist. Back then it was the Second African Church. And the pastor of that church was a Reverend John Anderson. Reverend Anderson, and here's where I'd like you to maybe make some notes if you want to, and write down some of these names. I, just didn't go through the whole process of putting everybody on the slides, but Dr. Anderson, or Reverend Anderson, worked for an Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist. I won't go into their whole story, but because he worked with him, and this Elijah P. Lovejoy is a very famous person as well, he knew the laws and the rules of freedom for slaves. Being their pastor, he advised them. So on April the 6th of 1846, Dred and Harriet went to the old courthouse and they petitioned to sue for their freedom. So when I say petition, I mean that those things that I just showed you on the list, they knew they could prove all of that. So they had the grounds to claim their freedom and to prove it. The picture you're looking at is a very old picture of the old courthouse in the 1800s. And this is a young picture of Mrs. Emerson. We generally have an older picture of her. I didn't show that to you today. So the day they went in and petitioned for their freedom, they were now initiating a suit against their owner. That was a scary thing to do. When you think about it, there was this old phrase that we used to hear as kids: if you don't shape up, I'm going to sell you down the river. And kids didn't know what that meant, but they were hearing their grandparents echo the things that they had heard as children, meaning that we will sell you down the river to the south, where they really treat you bad, and you really are going to have a hard time and you don't want to go down there. So Dred and Harriet had these two daughters, and we'll talk more about them too, Eliza and Lizzie. And the older girl was 8 years old, and the younger one had just been born within weeks to maybe 2 months at the most when they went and petitioned to sue. The point being that Dred Scott was free. I used to say wanted to be free, and then I actually realized that in this man's heart and mind, he recognized that by the law, I was in free territory for several years. My wife was. My daughter, my oldest daughter, she was born on the riverboat Gypsy on the Mississippi River. Rivers are considered free territory. They don't belong to one state or another. However, of course, the child was a slave because her mother was a slave. And yet he wanted his freedom. He did not want to be held by Mrs. Emerson anymore. And honestly, she was not as kind as her husband, who tried to be more civil toward them. Well, they filed their petition. They went to court. It took about a year for it to get to the court. And let me see what the next one is. Okay, I'm not there. Then it took about a year. And so in 1847, they went to court. They had everything lined up. They should have walked out free people. Instead, there was a big problem. That problem was simply the fact that one of their attorneys had put someone on the trial who did not give a proper testimony. They asked to prove if Mrs. Emerson owned the slaves, and the gentleman said, well, my wife says she does. And if anybody knows anything about law or studies it or is interested in it at all, they recognize that as something called hearsay. And hearsay is not permissible in court. You'll just throw that testimony out because I heard say that she owned them, but that's what she said. No, when you're in court, it's got to be what you said. And since he couldn't say it, he could only go by what his wife said. The court, quote unquote, threw it out. Sometimes you'll hear it said that they lost the first case. Well, essentially it felt like a loss because they weren't free. But the court did allow them to bring that case back to the court with a correction of testimony. So when that happened, and and let me say this, that was in 1847, so they came back. It took 2 years for them to come back. Now I tell people, stop and think about that. If you had a ticket, let's say, because we can all relate to that. If you had a ticket and you went to court and they said, you know what, we can't make out the date on this ticket. This is all messed up. So we're not gonna, we're just gonna hold you here until we figure that out. And it takes 2 years for them to figure out the date on that ticket. That would be pretty horrible. But that's about what happened to them. It took 2 years, not because the court did anything wrong, but because there was a big cholera outbreak where many, many, many people died in St. Louis. There was also a great fire in St. Louis in 1849. And the courts were not big and thriving with a lot of, talented people and computers like we have now. Things were handwritten. There were a few here. The courthouse was new. There were other dockets that might have been more important than the slave cases. And so they just went on and on until finally, they got back into the court. This time, they presented proper testimony. This time, a jury of 12 white men declared the family free. So Dred Scott did get his freedom in the court. So you asked him, what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that the woman he was suing was very unhappy and she appealed that case immediately. And I told you her family background, so they were not going to just sit and take that lightly. They appealed it and it went forward again and went forward again, and finally ended up in the Missouri Supreme Court. The Missouri Supreme Court had tried cases like this before. It could have easily been that they would have said, well, we see the evidence here, and yes, they should be free. And that is what should have happened. However, the Missouri courts did not do that. They failed the Scotts. They said to them that times are not now as they once were when we used to try these cases. They were saying that politically the tide was turning, and Missouri is willing now to accept the consequences of having slavery within her limits or her borders within this state. They were saying that, we're letting a lot of slaves go. They've got cause, and the temperature is such that we just need to settle this down a little bit. So they failed them and told them no. And they did that on March 22nd of 1852. On March 22nd, 1852, their hope was all gone. I mean, they have gone for 6 years, keep in mind, 1846 now to 1852, 6 years, when they could have been out of there in one day. 6 years, and it has failed. So in their minds, this is it. Okay. However, there was a gentleman who changed the course of history. But before we leave that, I want to share with you that on March 22nd of 1952, that was the day that I was born. And when I looked at that one day at the courthouse, I marveled, and it just kind of hit me because I had seen it before, but one day I saw it. And I thought to myself, I was born 100 years to the day that the Missouri Supreme Court told Dred Scott he could not be free. So as a little sidebar, I'll let you know, you can look up Missouri's let's see, House Concurrent Bill 74, I believe it is now. And we are put in for a resolution for the state to renounce the Missouri Supreme Court decision because it doesn't need to do it for the United States. And we can talk about that later too, why not? But in this case, we're asking them to just denounce that language and say that, no, we don't believe that anymore. But one of the oddities of my life is that that was the day that I was born. So the gentleman who came in and changed the whole playing field was Roswell Field. And Roswell Field came to our rescue. He was the father of the famous child poet Eugene Field. And some of you, again, this goes way back to the 1800s, but some people will recognize his name. It's extremely famous. And their row house that they lived just down the street from the old courthouse is still there today. It is the only one, and we got it put on the National Historic Register. Eugene Field, his father, Roswell Field, lived in that home, and Roswell Field was an attorney. As an attorney, he's watching this case now. It's local, it's right down the street. He knows about it. You know, it's not the big news that the later case was, but locally it was something noteworthy that the Missouri Supreme Court would deny them and change what had been precedent in the past. Precedent meaning that we have always previously agreed that under these circumstances, a person could be free. But today we're going to change our mind. We're not going to do that. So Roswell Field didn't like that, and he kind of looked around and said, you know, there's got to be another way. So he found that other way, and what he found was what's called the diversity clause. Diverse meaning many, many meaning more than one or another. In this case, the diversity clause applied to this case because I've got to get her name right now, Mrs. Emerson, because it changed, moved away, and Mrs. Emerson left all of her business to her brother. She went out to find another husband and moved to Boston. Roswell Field took this case because the brother lived in New York. And now we have diverse states, diverse locations. And now we can sue in the federal court, which means we bumped it up to a higher level of legal analysis. And people on the federal level started to look at the case. I have to see what my next slide is. Okay, so meanwhile, back in Boston, I'll share that Mrs. Emerson finds a new husband. She finds a new husband in one Dr. Calvin Chafee. Dr. Calvin Chafee was a congressman, and he was also a dentist. So Dr. Chafee. Dr. Chafee did not know that his wife owned famous slaves or any slaves. He was an abolitionist. And she went there and married him and did not tell him she owned any slaves. But over the years, this case is now coming up towards the Supreme Court. And one day he reads in the news that his wife owns these famous slaves. And he's undone, totally undone. The case is now nearing its end because it has been lost once more on the federal level and bumped up again to the Supreme Court. Now, the process of getting this done, Dred Scott literally participated in a pamphlet where in the first person he asked for help. They asked for someone in Washington, D.C. who would be able to take his case because he didn't have any money. And the people who had been helping him, they'd been helping him for 6-7 years. And it was like they're drained a little bit, but they were still by his side. They needed help. This gentleman began to correspond with Roswell Field and the attorney who was now Montgomery Blair. And they did talk about this case. But in the meantime, it's making its way up to the Supreme Court. And when it gets there, the Supreme Court also fails, not just the Scots, but all African Americans. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who was the Chief Justice who read the majority opinion, he said that Blacks had no rights that whites were bound to respect. Technically, you don't count. He said that Blacks were inferior beings and so far inferior that they shouldn't associate with the white race, that slavery was for their benefit. I'm paraphrasing this so that I'm not reading the legalese to you, but this is exactly what they were saying. Well, these are inflammatory words. In other words, they inflame and ignite a lot of emotion. And it was a terrible thing to say. What he did and the way he justified this was by using the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment was about property rights. And that's why you hear people say that they told Dred Scott that they weren't people, they were property, because they erroneously used the Constitution to declare them property, saying that the people who owned him, they had the right not to have their property taken away from them without due process. And so we're getting to some legal terms, but if you want to look up due process and the Fifth Amendment, that would be another note you might make, and really get to delve into that, because it's very fascinating. The premise is very good. It protects us all, but we are all people. And in this case, it did not protect the people of Dred, Harriet, Eliza, and Lizzie Scott. But further, it did not protect other African Americans. Now, one thing you must know, every Black person was not a slave. Every Black person was not born into slavery. Some Black people were born free. They had homes, they had businesses, they were educated, they wore nice clothes. And many, of course, of these people lived in the North, because we have this distinction between the North and the South. But when the Dred Scott decision came out, they were being told that Blacks had no rights that people were bound to respect. And so it was including them. That was difficult, very difficult. It didn't take their freedom away, but it took their freedom to be free away. And so there was a lot of discord there. And of course, the Dred Scott decision was very much a major catalyst for the Civil War. Now, Taylor Blow and Charlotte Blow and Henry Blow in the background were working to help free Dred Scott, because let's go back. He was owned by Mrs. Emerson. She moved and married an abolitionist. The abolitionists didn't know anything about the slaves. He's upset, he's embarrassed. He didn't even run for office the next term. He needed to squelch this, and he wanted them to have their freedom. So I have letters here, and I don't know that you'll be able to see it too well, but I have a notebook full of letters, and they are exact copies from the Library of Congress between Montgomery Blair, the attorney, between Roswell Field, the attorney, and between Calvin Chapee, the new now owner of the slaves, who doesn't want them. And these letters hatched a plan, if you will, on how to get the family free. And they came up with selling the family to Taylor Blow. Now, Taylor Blow is the gentleman on, I think, your left, with his arm on the chaise there. Taylor Blow was the 10th of the 11 children of Peter Blow. And Taylor Blow, Henry Blow in the Oval, and Charlotte Blow, brothers and sisters, throughout this 11-year ordeal, they were supporting and helping Dred Scott. They never owned slaves. They grew up with him. Dred probably looked over Taylor. Henry might have been a little bit older than Dred, but they all knew each other from Virginia and from Alabama and into St. Louis. And they apparently had positive feelings toward Dred Scott. They knew him to be a good man. They knew him to have been cheated. They knew him to have been cheated twice. And they were there for them. They were there for them. So Taylor Blow agrees in this 3-part arrangement to buy the family for $1. $1 for Dred, $1 for Harriet. And with that $1 sale, Dr. Chapee, his wife, Irene Emerson Chapee, and her daughter, Henrietta Chapee, and I say her daughter because this is something you have to remember. If you don't do things legally well, you can get messed up. If their daughter had not participated in this arrangement, she could have come back later and said that she owned them when her parents died. But she and her parents were on a document called a quitclaim deed. And again, that won't mean that much to you, but a quitclaim deed, quit like I quit playing ball, quit claim. I quit and stop any claim to these slaves. I give you a deed that says you now owe them. I don't want any money. I just don't want them. I'm giving you a deed that says you have them. They're yours. I quit my right to ownership of them. All three of them have signed that. I have copies of it. And therefore, they now were under the arm of Taylor Blow, who, by the way, only bought them so that he could free them, which he turned around and immediately did on May the 26th of 1857. So less than 3 months after the Dred Scott decision, the Dred Scott family actually was a free family. They were free and they were famous. Famous because the Dred Scott decision kicked off such a firestorm. I would suggest to you, if you can research and look up what I have found years ago, it was one of the most fascinating finds that I came across, something called the Session Era Papers. Session Era, ERA papers. In other words, the time that the lower states seceded from the nation. It was that time. But the papers that you're looking for are the ones dated March 6th, and the next few months, March 6th of 1857, the North and the South newspapers were just battling it out, talking about this case, how wonderful it was in the South, how horrible it was in the North. The abolitionists were further inspired to continue their fight to end slavery. In the meantime, on June 27th, again, just barely 3 months after the decision and after they got their freedom in May, the Dred Scott family were on the front of the Frank Leslie Illustrated. The Frank Leslie Illustrated, it was a very famous newspaper. Another very famous newspaper was Harper's Weekly. And these were like Time Magazine, Life Magazine. It's like CNN. If this had happened today, they would be all over the news channels. It would just take it over. That's how critical all of this was. And in this newspaper, the interview goes on to another page and gives a lot of insight and details to what happened with the family after it was over. So again, the family is quietly getting their freedom in the background while the nation is swelling towards war. And so that's another history lesson, but you do know who Abraham Lincoln is, and you do know there was an Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of people don't understand that that was not what freed the slaves in America. It's what freed the slaves in technically the South, but in any location that went against the Union. Mostly that was the South. So he freed the slaves in the South. And I like to say that it was a strategic move because as they were freed and moved to the North, a lot of Black men fought in the Union, which was the North, to keep the states together, the Union. They fought there for their freedom as well. So the Emancipation Proclamation was on January 1 of 1863. The war started in 61, April in 61. So halfway through, he frees the slaves of the South, but with the full intention of winning the war so that all could be freed. And of course, that did happen on April the 9th of 1864. 1865. And then Abraham Lincoln was assassinated less than a week after that. I can't go into all of that story, but you need to know that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated less than a week after he had won the war. A great loss. But ultimately, our government did pull the nation back together. We allowed the South to come back. And then the amendments that were brought forth were the 13th, which you see abolishing slavery. That's a document that declares that all men who were previously, Black men, had been previously held in servitude, men and women and children were now free. The 14th Amendment declared that they would be citizens. And the picture that you see with the gentleman with the white beard, his name was Thomas Gandy, and I believe he may have another name. He was the first Black man to vote, and his hand is him reaching in and putting his vote in the ballot box. That's the 15th Amendment. It gave Black men the right to vote. In case you weren't aware of it, women did not get that right, not women white nor Black, until 100 years ago in 2019. And so this is the year from 19 to 20 where women did have an anniversary, but it took them many more years to get that right. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are oftentimes called the Dred Scott Amendments too. And they're called that. They're also called the Reconstruction Amendments, because once the war was over, we had to rebuild the nation. And Reconstruction Amendments allowed Black people to participate now as citizens, not as property. So I'm going to kind of segue just a little bit off here, because I want to, give you some other little tidbits. And Susan, I'm going to ask you to give me a point on the time, please. Oh, I can't hear you, unfortunately. I can't hear
Sorry,
you.
there we go. Okay.
Oh, thanks.
It's 11:31, so I believe we're going till close to noon. So maybe give yourself 20 minutes. So if there are questions.
Yeah, I've got a few more slides here. And then, but the 11:30 something, that's fine. We're in good shape then. So, so the Dred Scott family, I'm gonna kind of give you a wrap up of what happened to them, and then I'm gonna share some things with you that aren't well known. The case itself is one of the most important and probably considered the most notorious and worst case ever rendered by the Supreme Court. One of the judges even said that the court provided itself a self-inflicted wound when it made this decision. It was not a good decision. Many people have studied it, but if you're a lawyer, you have to study it to get through law school. And it's just one of those cases like an onion, you just keep peeling back more and more layers of it. Most cases aren't like that. The Dred Scott decision, when it was rendered by Roger B. Taney, was about 80 pages long. And that was huge. And it took him, an old man, reading very slowly and very quietly. The room, you could hear a pin drop. It took him a long, long time to read that. Most Supreme Court decisions are maybe 6 or 7 pages long. So compare the intricacies of the pages and all that they said. But here's what's wrong with the Dred Scott decision, besides the fact that they said that the family and Blacks could never be free. They also said none of their descendants could be free. So that means that any children and any grandchildren and people like myself, people like yourselves, we would not be free if the Dred Scott decision had held. The Dred Scott decision was also, I will say, decided by every single judge on the court. Normally you get one decision, and the one you hear about is called the major decision, I guess. But every judge on that court wrote a decision. There are 9 judges on the Supreme Court. Every judge wrote their own decision. That was highly irregular. Part of it was because they disagreed with what Justice Taney was saying. 2 men totally disagreed and said they should be free. The other 7 said, well, I don't think they should be free, but I also disagree with this over here, and I don't like that over there, and I think it should be like this. What the court did in the Dred Scott decision was what we call now today being like an activist judge or an activist court. They took the Dred Scott decision and took opportunity to rule, which was not their right to do, on 2 other issues that had nothing to do with whether or not Dred Scott and his family should be free. Instead, they took the opportunity to say that the Missouri Compromise was invalid and that Congress had no right to adjudicate on either that nor the Northwest Ordinance. Now, both of those were ways that the government had decided that we would not have slavery everywhere. Some states can be free, some can be slave. That was the Missouri Compromise. So they brought in the Missouri as a slave state. The next one, Maine, was a free state. The next one was supposed to be a slave, and on and on. That was the Missouri Compromise. They said, no more of that. We're just going to have every place be slaves. And then they said the Northwest Ordinance wasn't, they had no right to even talk about that back in the day, which was around 1838. They had no right to say anything about the territories. The territories was the area west of the Mississippi that had not been yet developed. People were moving out there slowly, going toward California, but these were not states yet. They said that there could be no slavery in the Northwest territories. And that's where Dred Scott was when he was at Fort Snelling, which is why he was in free territory. But the court said on that day, which was March 6th of 1857, that all of this area from coast to coast were eliminating all the laws that would ban slavery. Another reason why there was the big war. So there's so many ramifications to this case. It just goes on and on. But I want to share again now here in the shadow of Dred Scott. That's a name of a book title. And basically it taught us, and we found out in, I think it was 2003 here in St. Louis, that we found about 300 freedom suits in the basement of an old courthouse here. And they were suits that slaves had brought to the courts here in St. Louis to ask for their freedom. Now, not all of them got their freedom, but a considerable amount of them did, because they had those perfect and right grounds. And that's why when Dred Scott went, he should have had his freedom. There was no reason not to. And now we have the proof by finding these documents. So it was a shame. It was very much of a shame. I found out about more babies meaning that in our family, we thought that Dred Scott's two daughters, one of them married and one of them did not. We thought that the one who married only had two children. Those two children, one of them was my grandfather. But when we did our research around the anniversary in 2006, we found out that they had about 6 children. Most of them passed away. The other 4 did as young children. I think the oldest one lived to be 1.5 years. And other than that, they were months and days old when they died. And imagine again having 6 children and losing 4 of them. But what was really surprising to us is when we found out that Dred Scott's grave had been opened and one baby was interred with him, and Harriet Scott's grave had been opened and one of those babies is in her grave as well. So when you go to visit Dred Scott and our Harriet, now we can see her, we know there's 2 people buried there and that there were others. Another strange twist of the turn was that we found out that the wrong sister was being called the wife and the mother. It was actually the other sister. So as you do your genealogy, expect a lot of surprises because you will find them. And so nothing on the great Houdini. I like to say it that way because when Dred and Harriet were trying to get their case won, and this probably would have been about 1854 and 56, 6, 7, and they hid their 2 daughters away so well that to this day, no one knows where they hid them. They hid them because they were in danger of them being sold. There was a woman down the street who I like to actually refer to as the madam, and her business was in buying young girls, specifically so she could sell them down the river. Another reason Dred and Harriet wanted their freedom now, because every day that they didn't have it was a day that they risked their family being torn apart. So the girls were hidden away. And again, before I end all of my work here, I would love to know. Now I have a clue and a hint, but we can't prove anything yet. But I think that we might have an idea who might have had the girls. I don't know where, but I think I may know who, and I might know where. So stay tuned for that one. Let's see, another thing I wanted to share with you was the fact that Dred Scott's picture is in the History Museum in St. Louis, Missouri History Museum. There's a beautiful oil painting. It's the real picture that you saw in the first frame. That picture was dedicated in 1882 by James Milton Turner. Now, James Milton Turner is somebody you might want to write in your notes if you're going to look up interesting people in history. He literally was an ambassador to Africa, and he was a Black man. And he gave a eulogy to Dred Scott at the History Museum by invitation of the museum to dedicate this picture. And he said that he believed at that time that it was the first presentation of an African American in any great display of any history museum that we ever had. So we believe that that's true. I haven't found another one yet. So let me tell you a little bit about the younger daughter. Now, this to me is really fascinating. I knew that she was Lizzie Scott. She was the aunt to my grandfather. My grandfather and my grandfather had 7 children. My father and his younger sister were the last 2, 6 and 7. they were literally babysat by this lady. And when you think about the fact that my dad was babysat by Dred Scott's daughter, it's kind of like real close. You think everybody and everything is so far away. It really isn't. And so I started looking into her life and I found her death certificate. Her death certificate was from Homer G. Phillips Hospital, very famous hospital. You might want to look that up as well. A lot and most of the Black doctors who got their education in medicine had to come through Homer G. Phillips Hospital here in St. Louis, very famous area that it's in as well. Well, Lizzie died there. And when I saw her death certificate, I remember my aunt, who is now 92, and the last one of the children, saying, "Oh my God, she was old. Oh Lord, she was old as dirt, old as pepper. She was just old." And I'm thinking, well, okay, she was old. You're a little girl. Everybody's old to a little girl, right? I get this death certificate. I find out that she died in 1945. She was born in 1846. She was 99 years old and just shy of 100 by a couple of months. She died in December. She was born in either January, February, and I doubt March, because that's when they filed the petition. She was born. So she was 2 months shy of being 100 years old. So here's the thing. In her panoramic life, she lived her first 11 years as a child of the man who was Dred Scott in the Dred Scott trials and the Dred Scott decision. So at the age of 11, everything broke loose. And she was afraid. And if you see the whole picture of her, you see a little hand on her shoulder. That's her sister. I kind of cut her out of the picture, but her sister's got her arm around her because she was always afraid. She was always afraid, and that marked her whole life. She kept her blinds drawn. My aunt said they were thick and heavy. She wore severe clothes. She was always coming and going very quickly. She was afraid. There's a lot of reasons for that. You might want to sit and meditate or talk about that in your classroom. But in her life, after the 11 years, there was the Dred Scott decision and all of the hubbub that went with finding out we're never going to be free, nobody's ever going to be free, and my daddy's name is attached to this. So the following year, 18 months later, Dred Scott dies, and now she's lost her daddy, who she, was separated from for a while. That's bad. Then that's 1858. Now we're going toward 1860, and President Abraham Lincoln comes too, but he comes because of the Dred Scott decision. A lot of people don't know this either. He was going to get out of politics, but because of the Dred Scott decision, he decided to come back and stay in. And ultimately, he was a hero. Well, she saw her dad die. She saw him come. She saw the war. She saw his assassination. She saw the Reconstruction and the amendments. She saw Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, another note for you to write down. She saw Jim Crow laws and codes come into, which was trying to put people Black into slavery, more or less. She saw World War I, she saw World War II, she saw the rise of Hitler, and all of this happened in her lifetime. And so I call it the panoramic life because she, people talk about going from horses to going to the moon. And in one sense, her life was sort of like that too, when you back it up. She lived to be 99, almost 100 years old. And she took care of those last two children, my grandparents. And her contribution to her family was that she helped to keep it together. Because with 7 children and my grandfather dying when my grandmother was 50, my dad was 6, my aunt was 3, it was very difficult. They went through the Depression. So Aunt Lizzie, she said, just call me Aunt Lizzie. She was another lady who was very strong and courageous. She did change her name. She was also smart. She changed her last name, but I knew her last name, and that's how we were able to find her. So I'm going to speed this up. I'm going to have to pass on this a little bit, but I just wanted to show you the first Black senator in 1868 to let you know that men did arise and take their place in society and were very, very articulate, very intelligent, and very much contributed. Lloyd Gaines was a gentleman who was not allowed to go to law school, and he sued for it. He won, but he disappeared. Because of that, my father was able to go to Lincoln University, and he did get his law degree. The resting places, I'm probably going to skip a little bit of this, but Dred Scott had 2 resting places. This shows the baby I told you was being buried with him. And this is where we found him being buried by Father Dowling in 1957. That's his headstone. It's very small, very sweet, 2.5 feet. They put pennies on it to commemorate him and Lincoln, but we're hoping to get him a new 9-foot tall, beautiful black granite marker here, hopefully for Juneteenth of next year. So we have a GoFundMe. If anybody would please share that idea, just letting you know. What we did in 2012 was dedicate the first and only statue of Dred and Harriet Scott. Our foundation raised $250,000 to render this, and it is fabulous and magnificent and has done so much for the community and those who have learned to come to see it. So with that, I'm going to say I'm done with the presentation, and hopefully we have enough time for questions. Susan?
Okay, I just wanted to read something to the students that I should have actually prefaced, Lynn. So I just have a letter from Senator Shaheen, and I do want to read this to the class, please, if you give me just a minute.
Sure.
So, dear students and friends, I wish I could join you for this morning's class. Please know that I am with you in spirit as you learn the story of Dred and Harriet Scott and the impact of their lives on the century and a half that followed their historic Supreme Court case. Thank you, Dean. I'm not going to go there. And a special thank you to Lynn Jackson and the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation for joining the class today and bringing a unique perspective to this thoughtful discussion. And this is where I think the letter really hit home for me. Our country's history has been the story of people marching, protesting, and sacrificing to make America a better, fairer place that lives up to its highest ideals. There have been setbacks and struggles in that journey, including the Dred Scott decision. But each step backwards has challenged we, the people, to look inward and reflect on our founding principles of freedom and equality. The sad reality is that those principles have not always extended to all people. But we move forward with the hope that an honest examination of history and frank and candid conversations about current issues will lead us in a positive direction away from the mistakes of the past. Your young voices should be welcomed addition to this American story. My message this morning is this: social studies is not a subject found in dusty textbooks. It's the story of people demanding positive change. Writing your own chapter of this unique story requires not only an understanding of the past, but a vision of how our country will fulfill its highest ideals in the future. I have every hope that your generation will continue the meaningful progress we've made in this important endeavor. My best wishes to all in the coming school year. Sincerely, Jean Shaheen, U.S. Senator, New Hampshire.
Thank you.
So I just wanted you guys to hear that. That says something. The one thing that you brought up, Lynn, for me, and I actually was remiss in sharing with the students, is that we talked about Missouri during the Civil War, and I goofed on that. I should have shared with you. Missouri was considered a border state.
Right.
Which means that they didn't take or adhere to slavery or having it. So that's important for you to know about this story, is that while he was in Missouri, he and his wife Harriet, in and out, they were a border state which did not have the slave laws. Okay, so by right, he was in a state that did not have slavery, ergo, therefore, he had the common claim. Okay, so I'm sorry I didn't share that with you prior to the class. Lynn, that was my fault, and I'm sorry about not sharing that.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, you're absolutely right about it being a border state. And what I sometimes share with people, and I also have a picture, there were slaves that were sitting in church next to free people. So it was a mixed bag, and it still sort of is. But they allowed slavery here, but they also, it was kind of like, well, we got some free people and we got some slave people, so we'll just deal with it. But that's where the Missouri Compromise comes in, and that's one of those things you can look up.
I appreciate that. I also know about the GoFundMe. I texted Commissioner Arblue had another appointment, so he, as he had mentioned, signed off. I sent him the PowerPoint and the GoFundMe, and he said absolutely he will share that with New Hampshire administrators and educators. Wherever that goes, I hope it brings us forth to Juneteenth 2021. Because I'm coming.
Okay.
I want to see what happens. So there you go.
We'll look for you.
Anyone have any quick questions for Lynn before we wrap up the class? Anybody? Morgan? Can you see Morgan?
I do see him in the corner there.
Go ahead, Morgan,
Yes.
bring it up.
Okay. Early in your presentation, you talked a lot about. Turner's Rebellion and how Scott wasn't very much involved in it. I'm wondering if there's any documentation of his opinions.
Oh, okay. You know what? I barely can hear you. I talked about Nat Turner's Rebellion and
Come on up here.
okay, yeah.
I'll
Come
put you
closer.
in that. So go ahead.
Mhm.
Wondering if you have any documentation of Scott's opinion on Turner's Rebellion.
Oh, actually, we do not. Actually, we don't. And that's one of the sad things about Dred Scott. There's so much said about him, but very, very little said from him. You know, I do have some quotes and I've been collecting them over the years, but I don't have that. You see, one of the problems is that people didn't really care what they thought. So because they didn't allow them to read or write, he wasn't able to write it down. It's a little different than Frederick Douglass, who at the same era, they were there at the same time. But Frederick Douglass ran away and then he procured his freedom and he went to Europe to stay free and came back. But he was educated and highly articulate. Dred Scott was brilliant, but he didn't have the education and he was not allowed to read or write. So we don't have a lot from him. We have to kind of extrapolate what he might have felt and thought. So I appreciate that question, though.
That was a great question. The other thing, too, is I think the point made was where Frederick Douglass was more of a gradualist, that if we have abolition, we don't need to be as violent, whereas William Lloyd Garrison, who kind of brought him in Boston, was the one where the war will win all this.
Yeah.
Where Nat Turner wanted the rebellion to say this, and then we're going to have freedom. Again, Dred Scott was like, there's other ways to do it without leading to violence and bloodshed.
There's evidence that he said that?
No, the point that she's saying is no, it's not, but people that were around him. You have to understand, where she talked about hearsay, folklores are told, I mean, by the hand-me-downs, right? The stories that we tell. So back then, and I'm not discounting her great-great-grandfather, but if a slave said something, no. When Frederick Douglass spoke in Boston at abolitionist meetings, people were there to record, to write, because these were pamphlets that went out. Dred was not afforded that kind of, I don't want to say flair, but where she talked about like media attention today, there was no one there to say, okay, let's get that down for the record. But it was an excellent point, Morgan. Thank you for that. Anybody else? We have one more. Oh, can you? Sorry. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question about, so a few years ago now, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up a museum down in Alabama about the transition between slavery and freedom, and then also the issue of mass incarceration. I was wondering if you had any part in those museums being set up down in Alabama, or if they came to you to talk about Dred Scott.
Okay, that's a good question. Actually, the answer is no. They do not come and ask us our opinions too often. But I do know what you're saying. There are a lot of museums now that are starting to bring in our histories and show them. For instance, I talked about Eugene Field in St. Louis. His home is a museum now, and they've just extended it. And they did a beautiful mural of him and actually his family in the corner, and I have a picture of myself. And in fact, if you look at Dean in the More or Less Perfect Union, that scene where I'm standing there, that is the Eugene Field Museum. And Dred and Harriet's pictures are huge on that wall. Another place where he is also at the Arch, which surprised me. He's in the cafe. So he's there. And then I went to Jackson, Mississippi last year. You were talking about mass incarceration. I have a friend who has a group called the National Youth Summit. It's the Ethics Project. And we go around the country and talk to youth every year. Normally we would be going to Alabama in a couple of weeks, but because of the virus, we're not. And I went to the museum in Mississippi. It's brand new. It's called To Mississippi Museum. You want to look that up. And there's a big picture of him there in the timeline as it goes through. So it's not like they need to ask us, you know, can they do it or whatever. If they wanted to do a bigger exhibit, fine. So in St. Louis at the old courthouse, which looks a lot better than that picture I showed you, that was the old one, they actually have closed it now for a couple of years. They're going to totally renovate it. And Dred Scott will get one of the whole wings of the building to himself as an exhibit hall, and that's going to be a great improvement. So in that case, I am very much involved with that one. It's local. Yeah, the Smithsonian, however, they need to do a little bit more. His name is on the wall, but they really haven't done an exhibit there yet.
Thank you so much
Anybody else?
for all the work you do to really forward us into more awareness about our history. It's really important work, and we're so grateful that you spent this time with us today, this morning. We
Well,
are.
thank you.
alternative.
I enjoy it so much, and I really wish I could be there with you in person. This is really hard on all of us, I think. But I would love to do the reconciliation component for you on another day, because I purposefully just didn't get into it because I would have touched on something that I couldn't finish. But it's a beautiful story.
Lynn, we will be in touch because I will share with you that I've got a classroom. I'm going to be ordering 13 of the books that I just ordered.
Oh my goodness.
For a classroom.
Wonderful.
So we'll talk about that offline. But yes, we'll be
Okay.
setting up times and going forward with that. I just want to say thank you so much for everything. It was awesome.
Thank you guys, all of you.